Very good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you so much, Osaka Bombay chapter, for inviting me to share my thoughts on blockchain security challenges. And we all know that this is the new buzzword which is in the market, one of the emerging technologies, and there's a lot of noise about it in terms of blockchain use cases. It can solve so many problems. It has got so many utilities, etc. While keeping all of them on one side, I'm not touching those aspects. Let me quickly spend some time on the security challenges, of course, with some basics of blockchain and how, as a emerging technology, how it can sort of adapt to these constraints or these issues. So the entire focus of this session is going to be surrounding those areas. A quick introduction about myself. I'm Narasimhan Ilangovan, a practicing chartered accountant, but by specialization, I am into technology, IT consulting, information assurance, GDPR and privacy law, the newest area of concern for many of them. I also spend some time on analytics, implementation of controls, ITGCs, your SOCs and the SOC audits. And also I've been a faculty for CISA, DISA, which is a course equivalent to that of CISA by the Institute of Chartered Accountants of India. And I also am a faculty on this executive course on blockchain. And I have a separate course on blockchain, which is available in a third-party portal, which I'll probably share it towards the end. But the focus over here is how is it that blockchain can solve problems? And more importantly, can blockchain create a newer problem? Meaning, are there security concerns? Okay, so that's what I'm going to spend some time on with my limited experience, what I've acquired through discussing, consulting few engagements on blockchain, etc. I thought I'll put in a few thoughts on how best we can go ahead. A quick disclaimer as a part of our organization policy: the views whatever we are discussing is purely from an educational perspective, nothing to go beyond that, and let's restrict it to that extent. So my agenda for today is very, very simple. I just have 4 broad things which I thought I'll probably discuss. First and foremost is why do you require blockchain? Okay. Then we'll spend some time on what is the concepts of blockchain. I'm sure most of you have heard so many things about blockchain. You may have experts who are listening to this session as well. But I thought we should have a level playing field. So I thought we'll bring in the fundamentals of blockchain and then over a point of time slowly go into the intricacies. Then third is the security challenges, and fourth is a few solutions or a deployment method or a technique. Of course, I am trying to address 3 and 4 simultaneously, but let me definitely take you through this entire journey. So let's look into what is the current situation or why blockchain. See, we are in a situation where we are facing huge amount of trust deficit. A product which you buy, you're not sure how it has come. A commodity or a news article which you consume or read, you're not sure of the source. There is a whole lot of fake menace which is going on in and around us. As though this is not sufficient, there are so many transactions which are happening in anonymity and I'm not able to identify. I'm sure you've been reading the newspapers which says, there was some sort of a fake news, there was some sort of a transaction which the government is finding hard to detect, a lot of things are surrounding that. On the other end, entrepreneurs or businesses are finding it difficult to get quality capital because people are not trusting, their resources, balance sheet, financial statements, or for that matter, the transaction. Not just that, in these challenging times, supply chain agility and resiliency has become a big question. And especially after COVID, this is an area which has been constantly asked or questioned. And therefore, it has sort of created some question in the minds of various people saying, can this technology sustain? Or, is there a solution for this? A lot of questions like this keep coming to us. And considering that and the context and that in the background, probably is there something to solve this problem? So that's one challenge. Then you have the never-ending reconciliation. You submit one thing, there is somebody else who has to verify, verifier has his own views, the person who's submitting has his own views, and this is a never-ending story. Every now and then there is continuous sort of a up and down, to and fro, correct? I have my version of truth, you have your version of truth, and the worst of all, both of them are not the final. So these are the challenges which we are all facing in today's world. So how is this challenge being converted into an opportunity by this interesting technology called blockchain is what we're going to explore. Before we move there, let's also look from entrepreneur or finance angle. Just adding this because blockchain use cases in finance are something which is extremely high, and that is one basis through which I'm just trying to explain the problem. I'll of course give you a few other examples as well. So I have a company. He has to coordinate with the supplier. He has to coordinate with the bank. He has an insurance company to which he has to coordinate. There is this auditor, professionals like us who sort of certify. Then there is this customer, where his information is there. And each entity has separate set of books, separate set of transactions. And there is no single version of truth. Everything has to be subject to reconciliation. Bank and my books has to be reconciled. My vendor and the customer and third party, and the entire supply chain has to be relooked into it. So these were the issues which were noted typically in this entire cycle. And then came this interesting technology which said, hey, you know what, I may probably have some solution. And that is where this technology interestingly came up. Let's look into how this technology works. So what exactly is this blockchain? I've been hearing a lot of noise on this. What is this, entire technology, and how is it actually going to make an impact? Let's spend some time. Let me demystify it before I go into these details. One common misnomer is many of them are on the presumption that blockchain is Bitcoin. Let me correct it. I'm sure most of you are aware, but nevertheless, as I told you, the first few parts of it, I stick on to the fundamentals and then quickly jump into that. Blockchain is to Bitcoin just like internet is to email. In other words, Bitcoin is one of the applications of blockchain and not the only truth or not the only thing which is possible in a blockchain. And this is something which is very, very clear, because many a times I keep hearing from people, blockchain is banned or not, is prohibited in India. Well, Bitcoin had some restriction. Of course, recently the Supreme Court reversed that decision as well. Let's not go into those nuances. So blockchain is not a Bitcoin. Rather, just like how we say email is an application to the internet, Bitcoin is an application to blockchain. That means, what is this entire technology of blockchain all about? How does this entire concept work? Now, before I go into the nuances, let me give you an example. Let's say me and 4 of my friends, we 5 of us decided to go on a tour. Of course, this is prior to the COVID or the Corona situation. So we said that, hey, you know what? Instead of every person paying, or instead of one person paying all the money, etc., we said let's each of them pay one particular expenses, and at the end of the day, let's share it. So I paid for the flight. My friend paid for the taxi. Another friend paid for food. Another friend paid for stay, and entertainment. We just divided amongst ourselves. And what we did was, every time, just to ensure that all of us are aware that the transaction is going through, not that we don't trust each other, but just we thought we'll bring in the transparency. Every time I spent the money, I simply posted a message on WhatsApp. We created a group for the purpose of the trip. Spend so much. And I simply said, hey, if you guys have any objection, please raise it out, or either you give a heads up, or the very fact that I see a blue tick and you guys have not responded, that means that this amount is sort of approved, etc. And each of us started doing it. And of course, let's presume that to be not exactly a WhatsApp, let's presume that to be a sort of an accounting software or a ledger or a simple spreadsheet. And every time a person updated, all of us would be intimated, and we sort of authorize, hey, you know what, go ahead. Unless there is an objection, things go on. And by end of the day or by end of the trip, we ascertain who owes how much by that one single ledger we all of us have. Okay, of course, each of us have one copy in their own mobile phone, correct? So therefore, the security, even if my system or somebody else's system is compromised, I still have one more version of truth, and all the versions of the truth are the same. My dear friends, in a very, very layman perspective, this is how a fundamental of how a blockchain works, which means a blockchain is a series or a transaction which is authenticated by the peer-to-peer network, whereby every time the transaction is authenticated, every time a transaction is authenticated, a consensus comes into picture. By virtue of it, the transaction gets authenticated, and that transaction gets added to the series of transactions which is already there. And that series of transactions we call it as a chain, and each transaction, let's call it as a block. A series of chain is called as a blockchain. You have to put it on a diagrammatic front. You can see it on the screen in front of you. There is a request for a transaction. That transaction which has been requested is broadcasted across these 4 or 5 nodes, endpoint. And these are all similar players. They're not that one is superior to the other. It's not that one is an RBI and one is a bank and one is a cooperative bank. No, all of them are peers. Therefore, we use the word peer-to-peer technology. And each of these players are referred to as nodes. And once this is completed, the validation of the transaction takes place because all the 4 of them have to give their clearance. It is a sort of this is popularly called as consensus. Once this transaction is verified, that verified transaction constitutes a block. Of course, in a case of a Bitcoin and other things, it may constitute a series of transactions. Let's keep it very, very simple. The verified transaction is a block, and this block is added to the chain of transactions, and therefore a block gets added to the chain, blockchain, and the transaction is said to have been completed. Now you might be wondering, oh, is this what blockchain is all about? Then why Bitcoin and other things? All those things, let's keep aside. Now you and I as professionals are going to look into this blockchain a little different. How is that? I'll be addressing that in the subsequent slides. Let's also look into, from a layman's perspective, or if I have to give a so-called definition of blockchain, it is an append-only ledger. Why do I say it's an append-only ledger? Of course, these are few things which I didn't bring into the previous screen. I thought I'll make a mention. You can only write once, read many times. You can't keep on writing on it, or you cannot rewrite it. Alternatively, if there is a mistake, you correct it by way of a fresh transaction and not by way of a erasure of that particular thing. So it's an append-only ledger. It's a sequential database. One after the other, you keep on keeping the track of it. It is maintained by decentralized network of users. This is the biggest change which blockchain is going to bring in compared to the traditional system. The traditional approach of security, the traditional approach of systems is all centrally driven, whereas here it is decentralized. Then it is responsible for agreeing upon the additions into the chain. In other words, these are the folks or these are the peers or nodes who say, yes, go ahead. No, do not go ahead. And it is secured through a technology which is popularly called as the cryptography, something where you have a plain text and you have a hash text. Using an algorithm, the plain gets converted to a hash text. Reversing it is not so very easy. Correct? So that's basically blockchain, and this found a big use case in Bitcoin. But over the span of time, people realized that blockchain has got much more applications, and that is what we're going to spend some time on, how those applications can be looked into. Also, from a infra or a security professional perspective, you always need to understand what are the various components of a blockchain, and that is what you see on the screen. First and foremost, on the topmost, you see what is called as a SDK. Just like any other application, you have a software development kit. You also have what is called as a runtime execution. It could be a Java-based, whatever may be the situation. Not to forget, you have API, because not everything can come into the blockchain. Please keep that in mind. If you want to understand, or if you want to integrate a few applications or a few interfaces or layers, you may probably consider using a simple API vis-a-vis, a complicated method of asking them also to come into the blockchain. An example could be the Indian government, the Niti Aayog, made a proposal called as, of course, you can go and download this document. It is available on the Niti Aayog page. It is called as a concept note on blockchain, okay, where they make a mention of Vajra, a blockchain platform for clearing and settlement of all these RBI transactions, okay, all these NEFT, RTGS, UPI, all of these are going to propose to be going through this platform, whereby all the banks will log in or all these net banking, or these, we call it as channel servers, net banking, POS terminals, all of these are going to interlink only through an API, and they're going to be select parties only who will form part of the blockchain. Correct? And of course, this entire thing is a private blockchain, details of which I'll just cover in the slide probably next on after that. So therefore, you have an element of API, SDK, runtime execution. Then let's come one level down. You have what is called as the nodes, and the nodes are those people who are sort of authenticating it. Let's take another example. Let's say there is a car manufacturer dealer, let's say like Maruti, and there are sub dealers or vendors or licensed people. Now Maruti and these vendors together may form the nodes. For all you know, it may not be possible for every vendor to form a node. So an association of vendors, let us say Tamil Nadu, Karnataka, Maharashtra, all these folks come together, form a sort of an association. That association itself may be a node. So maybe, let's say I have 20 associations like that, and one central, which is Maruti. So therefore 21 people may constitute the node, whereas I may have much more people benefiting out of it. Just like in a case of a Bitcoin, you and I may probably own a Bitcoin, but we need not necessarily mine or validate every transaction. There's somebody else who's doing it. Just because I need to deal with money, I need not be a bank. I need to be an account holder with a bank or a licensee with a bank. Correct? Like that, the same thing. Not to forget, this uses a cryptography technique. So therefore, key management is something very critical. And you require a peer-to-peer connectivity. A connectivity between those 20 plus one system, which I told you. In a case of a private blockchain, typically what we will be looking into, there are these sort of, independent players. Then on the central, you have the distributed consensus, the consensus protocol which validates. You have what is called as the on-chain and the off-chain data. On-chain data is that data which is actually there on the blockchain. Normally the transactional data, masters do not come there. Whereas off-chain is a separate database. Let's take an example. A car is being sold. You may probably just want to transfer on the blockchain the engine number and the chassis number to prove that this car came from so-and-so. You may or maximum could be also the amount or the basic value. You may not want to transmit the entire information from where it came, what was the GST number, what is the invoice date. No, you just want to transmit minimal information. So there is this concept of an on-chain and off-chain data. And you look into the incentive or charging mechanism. In case of a Bitcoin, the miner gets the fee. In case of a blockchain, which is an enterprise driven, let's say for a bank or for a company like Maruti, which I made a mention, the incentive is the savings which they're going to have in terms of cost, the savings in terms of the processing, or maybe Maruti may charge a sort of a small amount of bank charges, or a Vajra platform may probably charge a small amount of bank charges from all the parties. So that could be the incentive. And you have the distributed ledger, a copy of the ledger which is available with each of them. In simple language, 4 databases or 20 databases as the case may be. At the same time, you have an underlying infra, cryptographic hash, which is very important because every transaction gets encrypted. There has to be a messaging protocol, that is how the message is reached out, correct? And obviously the message has to be a protected or secured layer, correct? You cannot transmit the message without SSL or a basic security. And there is an event. In fact, the event is the trigger for this entire thing. You may have a setup, but the fact that I'm purchasing a car, selling a car, moving a car, that is an event, and each of them is a component. So I spent so much time into this because I wanted to make a mention to you that these are extremely critical when you're assessing the security. Taking this further, what are the types of blockchain? The 2 most popular types of blockchain is a public and a private. I'm not going into too much of intricacies. A public is where anybody can join. A private is where it is reserved. Example, public is a simple example for public, I would say, is your Bitcoin. A private is something which is my Maruti example, which I did make a mention. Just to get a context between a public and a private, I said public is open with everybody. Private, only authorized users can go for it. Public identity is anonymous, so you do not know who's actually doing it. In a private, you know each person. So this is something which is a trade-off, which we'll speak about a little later. Access to network in a public is without permission. Private requires permission. I cannot join a private blockchain without a sort of a permission. The code is open source because it's public, whereas private is normally proprietary. Trust is higher in case of public because there is more sense of transparency and everybody knows it. Private may be marginally little lesser, correct? But put it on the other way around, every information is made available public, so therefore it is no trust in case of public, correct? So it's a trade-off, as I keep on telling. So if you look from a confidentiality angle, public may have some sort of a trade-off, private may be more secured. But in terms of confirmation or a transparency, public may have more transparency compared to a private. So therefore that particular point I will interpret it in two angles. So I hope you got the context. And you know, there are various examples like blockchain, Ethereum, whereas private is Ripple, Hyperledger. These are popular means method. And authority of ownership is public, anybody owns it, or rather everybody owns it, and private, there is an organization or a consortium which owns it. Okay, for example, if you look into the banking fraternity, in the trade finance, there are close to about 6 to 8 consortium finances which have come forward. One of them is in fact sponsored by the government itself. You know, I think it's called as the Hong Kong Monetary HFT or something like that. There's a Hong Kong Monetary Fund who actually owns up that entire consortium. Okay, and miners or validators, anybody versus an approved set of nodes. So why is this relevant? This is relevant because we need to understand security issues in a private more in detail than of public. Because tomorrow you and I are not going to be auditing Bitcoin. Of course, if we do get an opportunity, that's different. But we will be auditing or reviewing, or we will be in charge if our organization deploys blockchain. What is the critical elements I have to look into? Correct? And that is the reason why I focus on private blockchain, otherwise referred to as enterprise blockchain. And not to forget, a beautiful concept of a smart contract in a blockchain is something really worth mentioning. A smart contract is basically a computer program, something like a exe file. It has certain terms and conditions and gets executed on a trigger event. Let's say, for example, when the government has declared drought, or when the agricultural soil has a IoT sensor which says that beyond this many days water does not come because of rainfall, it gives a trigger to the trigger to the insurance company to pay the compensation to the farmer. Look at that. That is a smart contract. A scenario where on a trigger of an event, the next set of activities happens. It is stored on a distributed ledger. It stays dormant until it is asked by or called by a transaction. And very important, they are written into the distributed ledger. So therefore, you and I know for certain this is going to be executed. And you have a whole lot of apps called as the D apps, decentralized applications, that are blockchain enabled applications or website. There are in fact a lot of gaming websites also which is coming up, you know, marketplaces are there, etc., that rely on the smart contract for processing. So you can see that, you know, there are a lot of use cases over here. Just to once again repeat and bring it to the context, I'm not going to touch upon a few basics. Of course, I did draw upon a few things to just to get the context. Few more basics, if you want to, I can give you a few links where you will definitely be able to go through it. Let's quickly move on to understand few other interesting concepts relevant. One very important concept in a case of a blockchain is a concept called as Oracle. Now, Oracle is an intermediary in a blockchain. He comes into picture because two blockchains cannot be speaking with each other, or there is a transaction which is outside the chain versus and inside the chain. Let's take an example. There is an insurance company. There is a vehicle which has had a damage, an accident. Now, it may ask, insurance company may be using a smart contract based method, or it may be using a blockchain based method. But how does it get the trigger or the, you know, input that there is an accident? Two methods. Method number one is I use an IoT sensor on the vehicle which gives me some indicator, then I can say claim is done. Or if that IoT sensor doesn't work, or in the existing scenario, a surveyor is expected to go there, or if it's a very, very serious case, you know, there's a police FIR, etc. All these things becomes the validating factor to push something onto the blockchain. So therefore, these, my dear friends, I would say are the agent that verifies a real world occurrence and submits it to the blockchain. Now, why am I bringing this? All these concepts, I will be able to explain it when I speak on the security challenges. I know I emphasized on the basics because without understanding the basics, we will not be able to go into the security challenges. So what are the security challenges we're looking into? It could be a hack, it could be a ransomware, it could be a stolen data, it's endless. Let's spend some time on that. The first and foremost you need to keep in mind is the concept of a trade-off across various blockchain. If you look into a public versus private blockchain, a public is available thanks to the number of people who are party to it, whereas it has a much more increased attack surface. On the contrary, private is restricted, the attack surface is much more less. Your permission versus permissionless is also another important thing. Generally we call it as a private is a permissioned, a public is permissionless. Okay, that's the general terminology. There are variants: public permission, public permissionless, private permission, private permissionless. Let's not go into so much of intricacies. You should also keep in mind user data privacy versus data which is accessible, modifiable, the integrity issues. So all of these things are something which we'll have to look into when we are looking into the security constraints. So let's address the fundamental CIA triad and the basic things one by one. The first we all know is confidentiality. Now, if you know from a Bitcoin setup, it's a public blockchain, and the entire focus of blockchain is to bring transparency. When I bring transparency, it means indirectly I'm compromising confidentiality. Correct? The more the information I disclose, or I'm always skeptical that everything is transparent, everything is known. You might say, no, sir, it is encrypted. Fantastic. But can I verify the transaction? Yes. Can anybody go and verify the Bitcoin transaction today? That is possible. There are public websites available. But the only challenge is, in a case of a Bitcoin, we do not know who has performed the transaction. I know that the transaction is performed. I do not know who has performed the transaction because it will only say the public key of the person who's actually performed it. Or in simple language, a username I know, I don't know who that person is. If you look from a database angle, it is not much of a difference compared to a traditional database. No doubt encrypted and other things are there. Even our database as of now has encrypted. But of course, there are some. I'm looking only from a confidentiality angle. Please appreciate it. Look into anonymity. Anonymity means any random person can do anything. Correct? So therefore, that is something which we have to look into it. Anonymity is difficult to achieve in a case of a private. So therefore, I get to know who's done what, and I know who is identified because I have given them only that access. In the case of a public blockchain, there is no anonymity is there, but that is also creating some sort of a challenge. So I need to be very, very clear. This is something very crucial. In confidentiality, you need to be very, very clear and spell out what is confidential. Is it the person is confidential or the transaction is confidential? Very important. Because based on that, the entire layer of security which you apply has to be addressed. Correct? If you want a person to be confidential, that means you need to anonymize that person, make the transaction publicly available. An example could be you are verifying whether this land belongs to somebody or not. Correct? So in that case, you want to know who the person is, so anonymity cannot work. On the other end, you want to verify whether this land has passed through so many players. I'm least bothered who those players are. I just want to know how it can. It was initially a government-owned property or whatever the municipal authority owned. From there, it came to Mr. A, Mr. B, Mr. C. I am not bothered who these people are. I only want to know whether it came legitimately. In that case, I want to know the transaction, not the party. So very, very important to determine. So what is the risk mitigation method which I can follow? First, wherever confidentiality, please keep in mind, do not store the sensitive data on the blockchain. Try to represent it by sort of a, some sort of an anonymous keys, etc. You can consider using methods like zero knowledge proof, a wonderful technique in blockchain or cryptography, where you need not reveal your identity to prove who you are. So there are two parties. One is a prover and one more is a verifier. I want to prove something and he wants to verify. Correct? Let's take a simple example. A courier came to your house and it is a very, very confidential courier. Let's say your passport or something. And that fellow wants to verify who you are. So normally he asks for an ID proof. But what if that ID proof is fake? So he asked you to tell your Aadhaar number and he enters the Aadhaar number. But you are scared that if he knows your Aadhaar number, he might do something. So Aadhaar has a concept called as a virtual number. You can just generate a virtual number within few seconds. Give him the virtual number. Okay. Inform that this is the virtual number. He goes, enters the virtual number. He verifies that it is me, therefore proven. But he does not know what is my original identity. Correct? So that's basically a zero knowledge proof. And then of course you have the homomorphic encryption. Homomorphic encryption is a technique or a method where normally whenever you have to apply any logic, what we do is you have the data which is encrypted or which is hashed. On the hashed value, you don't apply any logic. You have to decrypt it. On the plain text is where you apply the processing logic. What happens in a sort of a homomorphic scenario is that the moment I have this hash, on the hash itself, I try to apply the logic, which means I am really not bothered about the plain text. So this requires the way in which the hashing has to work is a little different. So you don't use the same encryption standard, you have to use a different encryption standard. And not to forget anonymity versus data confidentiality trade-off. I told you in a public versus a private. Private, you know who the person is, but confidentiality is exposed. On a private, it's vice versa. Of course, you can build in these security features, a combination of this. The second is integrity. When I use the word integrity, we are referring to the risk that the ledger is fraudulently tampered. Fortunately, the biggest advantage of a blockchain is that the integrity is always protected. Therefore, this is a risk more in the private or smaller chains, not in the larger chains. And this also depends upon the input. For example, Oracle comes into picture. He is entering some data. How sure are you that the Oracle entering the data is legitimate? Off-chain versus on-chain transaction. Let's say in a case of cargo tracking, there is an IoT sensor which is tracking the cargo. So the data, the cargo can probably tell you where it is, which road it is, etc. But can it tell you when your shipment will arrive? The answer is no. Correct. So therefore, there are some issues around the integrity, and we also had this 51% attack. Permissionless chains such as Verge and Montecoin was subject to these 51% attack, which we keep on reading. A 51% attack in a layman's language is where majority of the people come together in a case of a blockchain and control the minority or change, without a structured consent. Okay, even though it's a fake transaction, 51% of the people have agreed to collude, and therefore the transaction takes place. Few methods: use bigger chains. Of course, for a private chain, this may probably take some time. Preferably avoid PII on the network, and oracles and the security around the oracles have to be looked into. Availability. Availability is the risk that I am a participant, I'm not able to access the data. And this depends upon the number of nodes. Let's say I want to validate a transaction. If your server is down, I can go into the alternate server and verify. That's the beauty of a blockchain network, because every person has a copy of the ledger. But what if all the servers are down at a given point of time? It's impossible in a case of a Bitcoin network, correct? Because there are so many. When it comes to a private blockchain, there could be a possibility. A server may obviously get down. One could compare that you have you have your base server and you have your DR server, both of them going down at the same time, a touch wood scenario, but it may probably happen. The other thing in a case of a blockchain, something which is always argued is real-time transaction is a challenge. Imagine the car was sold between the dealer and the sub-dealer, or manufacturer and the dealer. It's not even gone to the consumer, only the B2B part of it. Now, if one of the nodes is not available to validate, this will be on queue. It will be suspended. What if somebody has forgotten and switched off the system? Correct? So private chains are generally smaller. They're easily subject to some sort of a DDoS attack. And not to forget interoperability risk. I am operating a different blockchain, you're operating a different blockchain. How do we operate together? Can it compromise the availability? Can it compromise even the integrity? correct? So few methods to solve this are traditional methods like load balancing, the redundancy, DDoS solutions attack. These could be handy. And you can also keep some sort of a gatekeeping redundancy, more like a BCDR servers, etc., to ensure these things are taken care of. The next could be endpoint and key management. Protecting the user's cryptographic key is very important. And keep in mind that private have better KYC protocol for endpoints, so therefore you know who is joining in. But remember, this entire blockchain gives you a different approach. You earlier were under a centralization thought process. Now you need to move to a decentralization thought process. So your security governance is very important. Earlier you felt that, if I secured one server, I know I'm protected. It is like, your entire attack can happen only in one location. You keep your best of your defenses there. But now your system is distributed, which means you need to focus on 5 things at the same time, correct? And that is where, you have newer sort of risks which are coming up. And when it comes to key management from a currency network, currency perspective, he who owns the private key owns the currency. We keep on reading that bitcoins were lost or stolen. How? Because the private key was compromised. Somebody got to know it. And let's not forget, quantum computing is coming up, my dear friends. So quantum computing could break the cryptography, including a 256 SHA, and could also break the elliptic curve digital signature algorithm, the encryption or the algorithm which is used in Bitcoin. So what are the solutions for it? First and foremost, human or the end user is the weakest link in this entire thing. So user awareness, training them sufficient and adequately, ensure you have updated patch management, security updates, antivirus solutions. At the same time, look into from a security perspective, diligent backup, all these things are necessary. While I tell you, my dear friends, the solutions are fairly traditional. Of course, with some more amount of innovation, the problems are new. So which means as long as you're deploying even the traditional solutions, even your modern problems to a large extent can be avoided. But the question is not to forget the fundamentals. Then comes the biggest of all, the consensus mechanism. You can look into this one chart or the image which is there to your left of the screen, the number of consensus mechanisms which is there. And these are evolving. You have proof of work, proof of stake, correct? Proof of work, proof of stake. Proof of work is, a majority rule. A proof of stake is who owns the maximum currency. It's more of a value-based rule. Then you have so many further concepts which has evolved over it. So the risk of consensus mechanism risk is that, a transaction may get approved without a proper authorization. That's another risk. You could have a 51% attack. It could aim at validating fraudulent transactions. It could probably help in rewriting the past transactions. It may combine new or multiple types of consensus mechanism. It may introduce more and more risk. So the more complicated you make the consensus mechanism, you actually are making a mistake. So keep it very, very simple, correct? And for enterprise blockchain, the consensus mechanism has to be relooked into. That is something which is very critical. What are a few migration steps? Custom consensus mechanism require thorough thinking, consider pros and cons, require an audit, do a sort of a secure development SDLC sort of a process, deploy a proper structured testing methodology. I'm sure that will be able to, to some extent be taken care of. Then you have an interesting thing, smart contract. The smart contract, my dear friend, is a double-edged sword. On one end, something can be a benefit. On the other end, it can be a risk. The risk is that the validity of the triggering transactions is incorrect. I gave an example of a sensor in a soil. What if the farmer did not pour water over there for 10 days? And as a result of which the sensor recognized that it's a drought and started processing the claim. What if the claim was processed without even checking the fact that, he's made the insurance payment, premium payment, or a renewal case? Correct? And normally renewal, you have a period within which the insurance policy, they say that, or a new policy within 15 days, you can't claim, etc. What if these fundamental questions are forgotten? So when you bring in automation, certain vulnerabilities may be ignored, and therefore you have to look very carefully from that. Please bear in mind, private has some sort of a KYC. So therefore, to some extent, if something goes wrong, you at least know what it is. But if it's a public, and not to forget, how do you patch it? How do you sort of reverse it? It is impossible, because the entire focus of a blockchain is that it is irreversible. So what are a few mitigation steps? Secure coding practices. Third-party audits are mandatory, so you and I have a lot of opportunities. Multi-signature smart contracts, contract based on ownership. A lot of methodologies like this can bring in. You can probably also deploy a self-destruction in certain conditions. That's mandatory. I'm sure you've seen that, the fanciest of the Hollywood movies, they have a small button where you can self-destruct, which is known only to one person. Correct? Even if you look into our good old mythology that, God gave a lot of boons, but he knew where he could probably tap them. Correct? And that's what the mythological character or the hero of the play comes and he tries to tap it. So there has to be a self-destruction button. And not to forget your GDPR. Blockchain and GDPR have some sort of similarities, but they also have a paradox, especially the right to be forgotten. What do we do for the right to be forgotten? Correct? So that is something which you have to carefully look into. The right to be forgotten is an area which has to be carefully assessed. So my dear friends, that's a bucket list of security, and I did give you a few indications of solutions. Let's quickly look into how do I do this secure deployment. And I've given a simple steps thanks to some WF World Economic Forum research, which I was able to identify a few of these things. First, see whether your organization has the required expertise. Are they having that acquired knowledge? If not, I think first you have to focus on ensuring they have that. Second, define security goals. Please keep in mind, blockchain is a small part of your organization. Your organization goals should be definitely looked into it, and then you have your blockchain goals. Correct? Your security goals are much more larger. Blockchain is just one small case. You have a bigger, larger use case. Choose the type of blockchain, very important. Do not be biased. Look in from a use case, look in from various scenarios and decide. Once you're done with that, do a risk assessment. Do a risk assessment. Traditional risks will still continue. Probably top it up with a few more risks, which I did make a mention. Then you define your governance and your controls. Very, very critical. In fact, I have seen use cases where they have deployed ISO 27001 controls against the principal requirements of a blockchain. It is possible. You just have to think a little innovative. Choose the security vendor. Is he able to provide it for this sort of a requirement? That is something which is very critical. Develop this entire thing with a sense of security and securely. Your DevSecOps becomes very critical. And once you're done with this, monitor and regularly audit it. And this audit could be even your VAPT, vulnerability penetration assessment. It could be a secure code review, or for all you know, it could be a functional testing where they verify these transactions. And last but not the least, please ensure you have a mechanism to respond to incidents. That is very, very critical. Correct? So that's how secure deployment is focused on. And audit focus points, if you are an auditor or a GRC professional, ISACA has come up with a wonderful guidance note, and it defines about 6 buckets as audit scope. Of course, one of the bucket is security, because I wanted to make it much more larger. If I speak on GRC of blockchain, the issues are much more wider. I've spoken only on security challenges. I hope you're able to appreciate it. So the audit scope starts off with pre-implementation, assessing whether a blockchain is necessary or not. Please remember, blockchain is a solution, but the question is, what is the problem? What is it that the blockchain is trying to solve? Not every problem requires a blockchain as a solution. It requires certain fundamental attributes only based on which you can look into it. What is the governance? How do I have that controls in place? How am I deploying it? Who is the vendor who's developing it? Because many a times these are proprietary technologies, correct? So if you use an AWS stack for a blockchain development, vis-a-vis a Hyperledger stack, probably they may or may not work together. You have to look into it. So that's a development related issue. Then you have the security. Do not forget the principles which we spoke about. The confidentiality is the CIA triad, the consensus, the interoperability, a whole lot of things. Then you have the transactions. How do I verify the transactions? How are the masters configured? How do I know the consensus mechanism works? So each of this is a separate domain. Again, I'm not going to this in detail. One can download it from the ISACA just as a guidance, just for you to get it something more clear. But I thought these are critical things which I should definitely make a mention. So summary from a security angle, I've given you a gist. Don't forget the security basics. Could be as simple as the simple security. Defense should be in-depth, end-to-end. Bring in the focus on CIA triad and bring in security by design, security as a process. On the other end, blockchain specific nuances, decentralization challenges, issues on consensus mechanism, smart contracts I did discuss to a large extent, endpoint security and cryptographic keys. So my dear friends, this is the key message. Blockchain can help reduce inefficiencies, cost, fraud, whatever you can call it. It can significantly also reduce the traditional risks, but it creates newer and newer set of risks. When I say newer set of risks, some risk which was never envisaged because this is a blockchain based risk. Some more risks which are probably in the traditional domain operate in a different way. In a blockchain setup, they operate in a different way. So those have to be looked into. And this new landscape also brings in newer opportunities for professionals. It's only the fact that we need to be a little alert, update ourselves from a knowledge perspective, and see how best this technology can be used to solve the problems. So that's my key message for you, my dear friends. Thank you so much for giving me this opportunity. Thank you, ISACA Mumbai chapter, for inviting me. There's a quick brief about myself and my firm. We are from Ken & Co, a practicing firm specializing in technology-based services. And these are a host of these technology solutions which we have been able to help clients out, and this is something which is very exciting, especially advisory on blockchain, where I sort of discuss with startups a lot of these practical issues, and I realize that they have a lot of use cases which can be solved using this technology, but the security and the governance layer is missing. That's where professionals like us can definitely add value. So I hope that brought you a good thought process. I hope that gave you a fundamental clarity on what this technology is all about, how best you can use this technology. These are my contact coordinates. You can follow me on LinkedIn, Facebook, Twitter, YouTube. I keep on sharing the articles and blogs on technology. That's my that's my NGO, where we do a lot of charitable things. And of course, I have my own session on enterprise blockchain in apnacourse.com. Should you want to, you can feel free to explore it. Thank you so much once again. I'll be happy to take your questions, or else feel free to reach out on this particular link. Thank you. Take care.